all the comfortable shoes.
That's right. Or no dummies.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's a Flyleaf Books. We're your independent bookstore locally, one of them. Your attendance and your book purchases let us have these events, so we really appreciate it. This evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from Elizabeth Evitts Dickinson, presenting Claire McCardell, the designer who set women free, with Julia Ridley Smith. Woohoo! Elizabeth Evitts Dickinson is an award-winning journalist and author whose writing has been widely published and earned recognition in anthologies such as The Best American Essays. Dickinson lives in Baltimore with her husband and daughter. Julia Ridley Smith is the author of Sex Romp Gone Wrong, a short story collection, and The Sum of Trifles, a memoir about cleaning out her antique dealer parents' house, grief, and what objects we live with mean to us. She teaches creative writing at UNC. We hope you enjoyed the event. Remember, you can grab a copy of Claire McCardell, the designer who set women free, up at the counter after the talk. We still have a couple of copies if you haven't grabbed one yet, so get one of those signed copies. And we also have Julia's books as well up there, so grab those. I'm passing these over to y'all, and if you didn't get your book signed yet, then you can do that after the talk, I'm sure. Just grab one of the authors.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello. Hi, everybody. Hi, Carlina. Thanks for coming. Thank you to all of you for coming. This is so exciting to see all of these wonderful faces. Some of the faces folks I've known a long time. One I gave birth to. Other folks I've only met in the last week or two. New students, thank you for coming. And I'm so excited to be here with Elizabeth, who I met. I'm going to go ahead and give us our origin story. We met in August, September of 2016. I was just finishing up a stint at the VCCA, which is a artist colony in Virginia that I love because they give you a bed to sleep in, and meals are prepared, and a room to write in, and 2 naps a day is just fine. And lots of wonderful things happen, including I meet wonderful people. And on my way out, Elizabeth just happened to show up a day or two before I was leaving, and ever since I've been so grateful that we had that 1 or 2 days of overlap.
I knew we'd be friends when you told me about this barbecue spot in an abandoned old gas station, and I'm like, yes, we did that. I will go eat barbecue.
That might have been the last barbecue sandwich I had before I gave up pork.
I was there to witness it.
I know. So anyway, over the years, Elizabeth and I have been writer friends, and we've shared work with each other, passed work back and forth, talked each other up, talked each other down. So I feel really privileged that I have gotten to sort of witness the whole process of this book from start to finish. And I'm excited to talk to her about it tonight. And I think it's a wonderful book, and you should all read it. Okay, so there's the plug, right? Because I would not waste my time being here with her if I thought this was a bad book. Because I'm not that late. It is a fun book. Yeah, okay. So, first of all, who in the world was Claire McCardell?
I love to start off and ask, before my book, because I know some of you have read it, who had heard of Claire McCardell before this book? David, I know you have, because I have to introduce David, who was my editor at the Washington Post magazine. And I went to him and I'm like, I have this crazy idea to write this profile on this long dead fashion designer. And he's like, sure. It wasn't that easy. But in this room are 2 people who are very pivotal to this book coming to an existence. So I feel really, really honored to be with both of them tonight. And Julia is the reason I met David, because we all were at another writing retreat. It sounds like we have a very luxurious life, but I swear to God, we work really hard. But yeah, show of hands. Only a handful of people had really heard of Claire McCardell prior. And can everyone hear me in the back? So I first learned about Claire McCardell because right out of college, I was still too afraid to admit that I wanted to be a writer. So I was working in a museum, which was another excellent job. And they put on an exhibition of Claire McCardell's work, and this was the late 90s. And McCardell was from Maryland, where I live now. She was born in the small town of Frederick, Maryland, which In some ways, it's a little bit like Chapel Hill in that it's kind of central around a main town. It's got old architecture. It's got a college. And, you know, I was looking up at those clothes that McCardell designed in the 30s and the 40s. And I was like, wait a minute, I could see any one of us wearing this today. And it was also the late 90s. So I was wearing the ugliest suit ever made because I had been sold this like purple, I looked like an
I want a
Easter
description
egg.
of this suit because I've heard you tell the story about this suit a couple times.
It was like a lilac color. Who would sell a 20-year-old woman? And I was trying to dress the part of being a professional, and I didn't know what that meant. And I wasn't comfortable in these clothes, and there were no pockets, and it had there were shoulder pads still. It was awful. It was so awful. And I'm standing there like all sweaty because it was also material that didn't breathe. And I had no pockets, and I'm juggling everything. And I'm looking at all these clothes that Claire McCardell made. And I'm like, wait a minute. What happened? Like, really, that was one of my questions. Like, what happened? We sort of figured something out back then that made a lot of sense for women's wear. And I was curious not only that I had never heard her name, because here's the truth. Much of what hangs in women's closets today is because of Claire McCardell. She invented ballet flats in the 40s. In 1934, she had this crazy idea about mix and match separates. She modernized the wrap dress. She put hoodies on women's wear in the 30s. I can go on, and we'll talk more about some of her innovations. But if you got dressed today, a lot of what you wear is thanks to this moment in time when Claire McCardell and many other very brilliant women invented American fashion.
So you wrote a story about Claire McCardell for the Washington Post magazine. I have a lot of students here. Elizabeth kindly visited my publishing class earlier today, so we've already talked in that class a little bit about how you kind of came to the writing of this book. But what took you from being like, I'm so fascinated by Claire McCardell to, I want to write a very well, meticulously researched biography of Claire McCardell? What is the kind of I think in terms, when I'm thinking about nonfiction, I think about what I like to call animating questions, sort of the questions that are spurring us on, that we feel curious about, that we don't have the answer to. So what were sort of some of your animating questions as you were exploring the life of Claire McCardell? And why did you want to write a book about her?
I had a lot of questions about her because the first question is, why was she forgotten? She was incredibly famous during her lifetime. She was one of the most popular, well-purchased fashion designers of the time. She was on the cover of Time magazine. She was on television and radio. And if you go back, there are stories about Claire. A lot was written about her, of course, because she was so famous in her lifetime. And there were many times over the years where people were trying to sort of bring her name back to the forefront, including that exhibition that I saw in the 90s. But oftentimes you were hearing about her clothes and the innovations of the clothing and sort of this evolution that she ushered in modern sportswear. But my question was, how did she do it? How did a young woman from rural Maryland, who was raised outside of society and high fashion, and at the time, really Paris was the center of all design. America didn't have a fashion industry in the 30s. We were copyists of Paris. So the way fashion would work is all the famous couture designers like Chanel and Paul Poiret and Madeleine Vianney, if you know your vintage designers, they would have their seasons. American designers would take the boats over. They would go to the shows. They would see what was the French were doing. They would quickly steal their ideas and copy them and not pay for them, and then hightail it back to the garment district in New York, where they would make copies and start to just make clothes based on Paris. So it wasn't just that she wanted to be a designer. It's that she envisioned something that didn't yet exist. She envisioned an American woman being the originator of her own designs. So I was curious, at a time when a woman couldn't open up her own bank account, when you couldn't get a line of credit, when you were still could get arrested for wearing pants. There were municipal codes that you couldn't wear pants in public. I was really, really curious about how she did it and why she did it. So we can respect and love her clothes, but it was the reason behind her clothes. It was that sort of feminist ideal that women deserve to be equal, that they deserve to be comfortable and be able to move through the world, that made me want to understand who she was and how she did it.
And I think one of the things that's so interesting as I was reading the book is, and kind of discovering her character, is how she would encounter something in her life that sort of gave her the problem, right, for something she wanted to design. So could you talk, like, well, I love that story about her being at summer camp and when all the girls had to wear wool swim stockings, right, at a time when when all women had to wear stockings to go swimming and then like a dress.
Yeah.
And she wasn't having it.
She wasn't having it. So that was the other thing, is like, yeah, that's right. She broke a lot of rules. And so I'm always interested in how someone is both a visionary, because it's hard to be a visionary. It's hard to be ahead of the curve and no one knows why you're doing what you're doing. But also, how do you like get around the rules? And that was one thing that she was really good at doing, is chipping away at some of these dress codes. And yeah, in the 20s, on public beaches, women were required to wear bathing suits that were really dresses in a lot of ways. And there's a photo, I don't have it in my book, but there's this famous photo of a male like constable on the beach measuring a woman's skirt to make sure the length was within the realm of whatever, because heaven forbid we see an ankle. And you had to wear wool swim stockings. I didn't know this until I was researching this book. And I found this, every researcher's dream is finding like that one article that you're like, oh, there it is. Mm-hmm. And it was a Society page letter about Claire McCardell being at summer camp when she was a teenager, going to this big lake. It's a YMCA camp, and they were out swimming, and she convinced all the girls that they should take off their swim stockings because you couldn't swim in them. They weighed you down. McCardell was an athlete. She wanted to swim. She wanted to hike. She was a tomboy. She liked climbing trees. And they got in a lot of trouble, and then they had to the male counselors made them carry axes and walk in circles as their punishment.
Oh, that was a punishment.
Yeah.
I like this fixation on stockings is real. My mom had this great story about being in high school or maybe home from college, and she was going out on a date with her boy, and her grandmother she said before she left the house, her grandmother would come over and run her hands on my mother's leg to make sure she was wearing nylon stockings. And my mother said, I'd be wearing the stockings, but then I'd get in the car and get in the front seat with the boy driving and just take the stockings off in the car, which was much worse than not wearing the stockings in the first place, right?
Yeah. But I think what was interesting about Claire is two things. One, she came to fashion, honestly. It was a thing she loved as a kid. And at the time, she was born in 1905. So what she grew up witnessing was turn of the century Gibson girl silhouette clothes. It was a time when women still were wearing very structured clothing. You were corseted, you had undergarments and boning and all of these things that were structuring the clothes so that the clothes made your silhouette. You didn't fill out your clothes with your silhouette. And the other thing that she grew up with was the idea that women changed their clothes throughout the day. You had the dresses you could wear at home, but you never left home in your house dress. You had your day dress. And then, oh my God, now it's tea time for your tea gown. And then there was evening wear. There were a lot of rules and a lot of fussiness and a lot of discomfort, frankly, in being a woman. If you've ever seen the Gibson girl silhouette, it's a very tiny, tiny waist that the corset was structuring. And McCardell always hated it. She did not like this. She didn't understand why her 3 brothers got to wear pants with pockets. So her brothers were a big influence on her because she understood very early that men had a different reality than women and that boys had a different reality than girls, and it didn't seem fair to her. It seemed dumb.
Yeah, and I think there's also this interesting thing that I was following as when you talk about women being corseted, right? We're talking about middle and upper class women, right? You have working class women who are going out to work in service or work in jobs. They're not wearing these kinds of clothes. So really this is also a story of the evolution of what it meant to be a middle class woman and go from being homebound and kind of having these rigid clothing rules throughout the day that kind of dictated what your role was at that part of the day, right? I mean, you're really telling the story of the evolution of middle class women going out to work.
Yes.
And what this clothing kind of allowed them to do. what do you think were some of the, what are kind of some of the major turning points, or like a major turning point that you would say that Claire McCardell kind of realized what the need was and said, if women want to go out to work, this is what they need to be able to do. They need their clothes to do for them.
Yeah, I think you said the right thing earlier, which is she was a problem solver, which is really what good design does. Good design identifies a problem and solves it. She liked to sew, so she was actually kind of had that geometric mind of how clothes worked on the body, and she thought about that a lot. She had two parents who were traditional, but also progressive enough to believe that their daughter should get an education. So she was educated at a time when not a lot of women were able to go to college. In fact, her grandfather, who you'll meet in the book, founded or co-founded Hood College, which was one of the first women's colleges to offer a bachelor's degree. And Claire originally went off to college, and she was forced to study home economics, which I also learned a lot about home economics in researching this book, because if you're my age, home economics was like, let's go bake some cookies and talk about housewifery. But at the turn of the century, it really was seen as a backdoor for women to get into the sciences. And so what Claire's curriculum was biology, chemistry, bacteriology, and she hated it because she really was an artist at heart. And it took her 2 years, but she finally convinced her father to let her go to New York and study at what is now the Parsons School of Design. And again, her education wasn't about how to make clothes. Her education was how to illustrate clothes. It was more of a fine arts degree, because this was at the time when photography was in its ascendancy, and what she was learning how to do was draw clothes for like catalogs and department stores. But what she was also realizing is, what is it like to be a single woman in New York? And at the time, there were not a lot of places for single women in New York to live, because fine hotels would not give a single woman a room. They were thought to be of ill repute. It was very difficult to get a boarding house that wasn't sketchy. And she lucked out that there was a place called the Three Arts Club that was set up specifically for women studying the arts or working in the arts in New York. So she had a safe harbor, but she was thinking about all these things like, what does it mean to get dressed alone and you can't zip up your back zipper? Or what is it like to have to walk all over Manhattan because you can't afford a cab? What does it look like to take the subway to go see a play? And she was doing two things. She was having all these patrons of the arts give her old, like their hand-me-down French couture. And she was taking this really expensive couture and she was taking it apart. And she was ripping it up because she was teaching herself how to make the clothes,
Right.
while also thinking, how ridiculous is it that these women throw away perfectly good clothes at the end of a season because some fashion designer told them they needed something
skirt
new.
should be 2 inches lower or
Yes.
higher, or yeah, right.
So really, her early designs were her solving the problem of being an independent woman in New York at a time when a city wasn't really designed for an independent single woman.
So what were the things that you, I guess, as you were researching Claire, what were some of the things that most interested you about how she kind of struck out on her own, right? Because we were talking about how it wasn't that she had this like super dramatic personality where she's like, damn all these rules, I'm gonna just bust my way through, right? There was something a little quieter about the way that she kind of navigated the systems and kind of, like upturned the rules, broke the rules along the way. What was one of those things that you came across that you were like, that was really clever?
So one word that was used to describe Claire a lot in the writing about her back in the day was that she was shy. Like the media loved to portray her as this shy young girl from Maryland. And I thought to myself, you don't get to where you are in her career, which becoming one of the top designers in America, by being shy. So I wanted to interrogate that word. And what I realized is that she was working in the garment district. It was a largely male enterprise. The women working in the garment district were either models or seamstresses. It was loud, it was boisterous, it was multiple languages, it was noisy. And she was trying to convince her male bosses, because she was working in one of these garment wear lofts. She was trying to convince her bosses that they should listen to her, that she had ideas that weren't as fussy as the French, that there were women like her that would want to wear what she designed. And her one boss, Henry Geist, who one person described as a harassed veteran of 7th Avenue, he was a very harassed veteran. He just was like, "You're crazy." And he kept calling all of her designs crazy. And she adopted the term and started talking about her crazies, which were her original designs that she was sewing at home for herself. And one thing she did was she had a dress that was a breakout dress. And this is the dress I wrote about for that article in the Washington Post magazine. It was called the monastic. It's basically this dress. It's a unstructured, well, this one has a structure at the waist, but it's basically like, it was called the monastic because it looked a little bit like a monk's cassock. But really what it was a simple dress you could pull on over your head. And it wasn't structured because one of the challenges of ready to wear, if you don't have money to have a tailored outfit, is fit. How do you make something fit? We still have this problem today, don't we? So she figured a way that she could design this bias cut, for those sewers in the room, dress that when you put it on your body and you belted it at the waist to fit your waist or however you wanted to wear it, it looked really elegant. But her boss said, it has no hanger appeal. It looks like a wet sack on a hanger. Nobody's going to buy it. Because the way clothes got into stores at that moment was through buyers. There was no fashion week yet. Didn't exist. That wouldn't come until the later 40s. And so what Claire found out was that this buyer from a big store in New York called Best & Co., he was coming to look at dresses. And so she wore it. She wore the monastic dress. And she engineered an accident of bumping
She wore
in.
it not to show the buyers, but just like happened to be wearing it to work that day.
Because
right?
her boss
Yeah.
made it clear that he was not going to put that dress in the collection that they were going to show the buyers. And as legend has it, she went in, she bumped into him by accident, the buyer, and he's like, well, wait a minute, you didn't show me that one. And it became the best-selling dress of the season. It was a wild runaway. And interestingly enough, what happens? New York starts copying Claire's design. All of a sudden, she's being copied. But the other thing that was interesting about that is her name wasn't in it. Because at the time, designers did not have their names in the labels. It was either the company who sold it, so in this case, it was Best & Co., or it was the manufacturer. So McCardell just designed a runaway hit, and the only people who knew about it were insiders on 7th Avenue, but the American public didn't know her yet because her name wasn't in it.
So what happened to make the American public know her? When did the American public begin to realize, to know that's Claire McCardell design?
She, as you'll read in the book, worked diligently and fought very hard to get her name in her own label. So she became the first American ready-to-wear designer, male or female, to have their name carried in the clothes that they originated, that she designed. And once the sort of gatekeeping of the traditional buyers and the traditional designs of like, well, we must only wear what comes from Paris. Once people started to see what she was designing, what became marketed as the American look, women loved it. And her career really took off. But it wasn't without challenge. I mean, it was, yeah.
Yeah. So we've been talking about the sort of the fashion industry, but another thing that I think you do really well in this book is contextualize kind of like what's happening with Claire and her career in the fashion industry, but what's going on in the larger world at the time. And so one of the things that's really important in this story is World War II.
Yeah.
Right? And so all of the things, the changes that came to American women's lives because of World War II and how Claire responded to that in design. Can you talk a bit about what that aspect of the story is and maybe some of the research that you did around that?
Yeah, so I mean, what a great time period to write about. I mean, she comes to New York in the 20s. Then, oh my God, the Depression hit. So then you start to see how she reacts to the realities of the Depression. And then World War II. So 1939, Europe is at war. We're not in it yet, but it was clear what was happening. And America started rationing. So there were fabric rations, and it suddenly became very difficult and different in how you are able to manufacture clothes. I mean, just think about what happened during the pandemic and the way it disrupted trade routes. Basically, with the war, Europe got cut off. You know, like suddenly you couldn't get silks, suddenly you couldn't get lace. And in anticipation of a war, our administration here was saying, okay, you have to limit how much fabric you can use. We need to save wool and these other fabrics for military uses. And a lot of things happened in that moment, one of which is that I think McCardell thrived in construct, meaning her creativity really thrived within limits because she was very pragmatic. I think that her upbringing and Frederick she hated waste and she loved a design challenge. And so she started using calicos and cottons and all these crazy materials that weren't meant to be used in dresses and she started thinking about things like, well, even before the war, she was thinking about how can you get dressed for less money? And she came up with this idea of, well, if you have a set of parts in different, like you have a top and pants and a jacket and you can mix and match them, you could have 5 pieces, but you could have 10 outfits. I mean, she invented mix and match separates, which is the foundation of modern American fashion. It took her 10 years to get it into stores. But with the war, she started to get really creative. So there was a ration on leather. She went to Capezio. Is anyone here a dancer? So if you ever danced, Capezio was the famous dance shoemaker, and they were right up the street from her in the garment district. And she said, hey, what if we took your ballet slippers, but we made them in fabric and they could match my dresses? And she invented ballet flats. You know, so during the war, she was really thoughtful about what was needed, what was necessary, what was affordable. And then she also did something that was pretty dumb. She was one of the last American designers to sail to Europe. I mean, she sailed to Europe while Europe was at war in the winter of 1940.
I thought you were going to say she got married. Because she did get married. Which may have been a little dumb when you read about him.
But there was this moment where, you know, Europe was at war. Hitler hadn't yet gone on the offensive in the way that would really tip the scales. And there was this, because America was so dependent on Paris, a group of American designers, including Claire, sailed over. And I was lucky enough that she was writing home during that trip. And I have her letters where she was telling her parents, like, it's the City of Lights is going dark, and here's what I'm seeing, and gas masks, and she was saying there's something worse than war. It's just waiting for it, because everyone was waiting. And she sailed over on an empty ship, and she sailed back on a ship that was so overflowing that, you know, people were sleeping on deck. And 2 months later, the Nazis took Paris. And so part of, I think, her ascendancy was also that now there really was no way to use Paris fashion. So what she had already established was there and waiting to come out to the American people.
And she already had that ability to work within a constraint. When you were talking about that, I mean, that's something that we talk about in writing classes, right, or teaching writing, or, you know, how does a formal constraint. So for a designer, you can only have these fabrics to work with, or if it's a piece of writing, here's, you know, a poetic form, or here's 3 things you have to put in your story, whatever, right? So how, kind of this amazing creativity can come out of having those constraints.
Yeah.
And I think in that problem solving that has to go with that.
Well, and it was this wonderful moment where people were also being pragmatic like Claire, meaning beforehand, she was really funny about clothes. She would say, you know, crinolines, they're those big poofy things that go under skirts. And you look and they're scratchy. You know, her old joke was I don't hate crinolines. I just hate when they try and get into an elevator. Yeah. She was really funny about pointing out how ridiculous it is what women were being told to wear. Right. So one of the benefits, frankly, of the Depression and the war is that everyone else around her also had to be pragmatic, and suddenly they were seeing the wisdom of her designs, but what she was designing was also beautiful. I mean, I have some photos in here, but I encourage you to go online, because this is all black and white, and just look at some of her designs. She was a modernist, so modernism was in its ascendancy. She really respected other modern architects. She believed in that form meets function pragmatism. Nothing she did was wasted. She didn't put a fake button anywhere. She didn't put a bow on it. She didn't believe in like giving a woman a design frivolity for the sake of design frivolity. She thought of everything, and she would put her closures on the side so you could get dressed. She modernized the wrap dress. We like to think it's Diane von Furstenberg. It was Claire McCardell. She did it first. And she did it because, again, you could fit it to your own body. You could wear it. It could look elegant. It could look casual.
And she was working with fabric designers. And I love the part in there where she's working with like the whole story about her working with Picasso and other modern artists where they went to like, they had Picasso design a fabric, right?
Yeah, they had, this was after the war where they, well, that was the other boon about this moment is that, again, it was also a moment of textile manufacturing really coming into its ascendancy. I mean, America at that point, of course, had a robust textile, well, like here you have all the mills, right?
Right.
And there was a lot of experimentation. I mean, I think the other thing that was interesting to me that I wanted to understand is how was it that a group of people came together to innovate an industry and how they did it in America?
Right.
And it wasn't only women, of course, but there were a lot of women at this moment who were being very creative and just doing it in a way that I felt very inspired by. So Claire's publicist ended up being a woman named Eleanor Lambert, and she was the one who said, well, wait a minute, why don't we bring newspaper people to New York? And she invented Fashion Week. Or there was Dorothy Shaver, who was the first woman to helm a major department store called Lord & Taylor. And she was the one who said, why are we not making women and designers and American designers at the forefront of what we sell? Why are we relying on the French? And so she wasn't alone, of course. And so part of what I wanted to do in this story was also locate her in this lineage of women who thought about the ways in which clothes inform and impact the way you're allowed to live and move in the world.
So in World War II, we've got women going out to work because the men have left to go to war. All these women are working. They're keeping the home. They're working in factories, working in offices. The war ends. Go home, women. Right? So then what happens? Because I feel like this is a big turning point. Sigh. This is a big turning point in the story.
Okay. So we have the invention of modern sportswear, thanks to Claire McCardell in a lot of ways. She, play suits, swimsuits, what she's creating is what we're all wearing now. The war ends, and of course Paris is like, we're back, baby, and we're going to be bigger than ever, and watch out, here we are. And so how many people have heard of Christian Dior? Right? So we all know Christian Dior. Don't remember McCardell. So I can tell you the moment I knew I really wanted to write this book was the moment I found an article in her archive, and the title of the article was "The Gal Who Defied Dior." And that instantly made me wonder, well, wait, what? What was that defiance? What did she do? And then I noticed the byline, and the byline was Betty Friedan. It was a young Betty Friedan who was, in 8 years, going to write The Feminine Mystique, the great, critique for second wave feminism. And Betty Friedan was like, I don't understand what's happening right now. It seems like American women are struggling. It seems like we're unhappy. It seems like we're being told to go back in the kitchen and have families. And she went to Claire McCardell because she said, I want to understand how you did it, how you're doing it, like talk me through all of this. And what I learned about the defiance was that in 1947, the war ends and Christian Dior opens his first, he's new to the fashion scene. It's his first ever collection. He was actually McCardell's same age. They were 3 months apart in age. I never realized that. And he came out with this collection that wowed the world. And it became known as the New Look, if anyone's familiar with the New Look. And the New Look
was really the old look.
Which was really the old look. Because what Claire believed is this wasn't new. This was a regression back to that Victorian era of corseted women being objects. And sure enough, Dior said, my goal is to save women from nature. And he did that by designing a corset. His ideal waist size was 18 inches. and it's called a wasp waist for a reason. It's because a woman was supposed to be as thin and segmented as a wasp. And his goal with the new look was to create like a flower. He wanted women to have that classic hourglass shape. And I have some pictures in the book. And McCardell and her cohort were incensed, and it was such a sensation. And Dior is a massive success. But the women who had to wear it were less impressed. I mean, there were protests in the United States against the new look. People picketed outside of his hotel when he came to Chicago. And he's like, this is great. The Americans are crazy. It's perfect publicity. You know, it's like... And so what McCardell was seeing was women being returned to objects, women being unable to get dressed on their own. One model said at the time, I look great, but I can't eat, breathe, or sit down. And as Coco Chanel liked to say, Dior doesn't dress women, he upholsters them. And so that was the defiance. Claire didn't accept it, and she was this alternate narrative to Dior. And so that I set up that conversation.
Yeah, and you have that great quotation from that letter that Jacques Fox. Do you want to read a little bit of that?
Oh yeah, I should have. I said I was going to mark it,
You were
and then I
gonna
didn't mark
find
it,
the
but I
page.
can set it up because what she understood is that fashion was far more than what you wear. It signaled cultural intent, and so she really did have this feeling that women were going backwards, and that you were seeing or being told to go backwards, and that you were seeing that in the silhouette of the clothes. If I can't find it quickly.
Tell a joke.
Yeah, you want to tell a joke?
I don't have any jokes.
Okay. So it wasn't just about Dior saying we're better and the French are better and the American look is too casual. It was also that there were a lot of couture designers, these are the handmade custom designers, who were saying women shouldn't be designers. And there was a contemporary of Dior's name, a guy named Jacques Fox, who was just as famous and popular at the time as Dior. And Jacques wrote a letter. And his letter said, and I quote, "Women are poor creators because they try to dress every other woman in the type of clothes they themselves like. Fashion is art is creative, and men are the creators. Look at the great painters, the great sculptors, the great writers. The woman designers see fashion as she likes it, but a man will see it as hundreds of women like it. There'll come a day when all great designers are men." And a writer from the New York Post mailed this letter to McCardell, and it felt like a direct shot across the bow at her, because he really was talking about women designers like her and like Coco Chanel. And the thing about McCardell is she rarely got into these public spats, because she understood that if she spent all of her time fighting misogyny and dumb thought, she'd be spending all of her energy on that, right?
She doesn't have a Twitter.
She doesn't. She understood that you never read the comments, you just keep doing your work.
That's right.
And so, but I'll read this quickly. Lately, though, she had noticed the increasing backlash against women working in her profession. The question of whether a woman should work at all after the war was far from settled. In fact, it had once again become a vigorous debate. The attack by Fath may have felt to her like more than a spat between male and female designers, and more than the long-standing France versus America rivalry. It represented so many filaments bound together into a larger, formidable mass, a skein of misogyny that attempted to hamper women. McCardell rolled a sheet of paper into her typewriter. "Amen," her response began. "They never understand the way clothes feel. Their lines are often harsh and masculine. When Chanel gave them soft, feminine simplicity, it was Chanel they loved. Men designers almost go to a woman for final judgment. She may be a model, she may be a wife, but there is always a woman behind the throne. Someday, all designers will be women. Men, I hope, will be busy with masculine things."
Yeah, and I mean, I love that she talked back to that. But another thing I was thinking about when I was reading about that part was, I believe you said in the book that Dior is from a wealthier background, right? And obviously he's working in haute couture, making these one-off, very expensive gowns and holding that up as the ideal, which is that's not realistic.
Yeah.
For most women, right? And there's that thing of like, we've talked about how when the wasp waist comes back, right, it's signaling something going on in the culture. And it is back. And it signals something going on in the culture. And I think even more perhaps, or along with the male-female divide in that, that you're reading about, there's this class thing, right? Is that women, middle-class women, or women of, people who aren't super rich are made to feel bad about how they look because they cannot live up to a beauty standard that is set for the ultra rich.
That's right.
And how messed up is that?
Very messed up. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, just a comment, because it's interesting that this kind of circles back and back and back and back. And I was trying to flip through my Netflix. I'm like, why are all these shows about these nasty rich people? Like, they're not like normal level rich people either.
I
know what I'm saying.
I hoped that what readers would come away from the book with was not only just an appreciation and an understanding of her and her work, but like, I'm not someone who thought a lot about fashion or how to be fashionable growing up, but I did think I had to get dressed every day.
Right.
And so I think there's something very...
And you want to look nice and be comfortable.
And I think that there's something intriguing. What Claire understood, what I loved about her is she didn't believe women should follow fashion. She always counseled them to find their own style. And she said, fashion is fickle. If fashion isn't what you need right now, don't follow and chase fashion. And she said, during this whole Dior moment, someone on a radio show said, do you believe women have to suffer for fashion? And she laughed and said, no. I mean, my God, like, comfort is a keynote of style. And we've all been in that place where we're uncomfortable by what we're wearing, and it ruins our capacity to be in the moment. And we also have had that moment where, for whatever reason, we feel good in what we're wearing, and it changes how we engage with the world. And so she wanted to inspire women to find that place and to thwart the rules when it didn't suit them. And I found that so refreshing to have a fashion designer say, don't follow fashion, find your style, which I think is I took away that lesson.
That. So we're probably moving toward the time we want to wrap up and have questions, but just one more thing I'd love for you to touch on is that letter from the woman who wrote to Claire McCardell to talk about the dress that she kept for so long and what it meant to her. You say a little bit about that.
So one of the cool things about an archive is that, McCardell died young, and it was unexpected, and her brothers took some time. They were very sad. She died at 52. They amassed her letters and some of her things, and they donated 2 archives, one to FIT in New York and one to the Maryland Center for History and Culture, which is in Baltimore. And her letters and her ephemera are in Maryland. And what someone chooses to keep, I think, also tells you a bit about who they are. And McCardell was beloved by many of the most famous people in her day. Georgia O'Keeffe wore her clothes and was a huge fan because she could she'd walk the Santa Fe Desert painting and putting rocks in the pockets, because that was the other thing McCardell gave us, pockets. And Lauren Bacall, Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, people loved McCardell. And she kept a couple of letters. One I loved, which was a very salty letter from a woman who wore one of McCardell's bathing suits on a very hard-earned trip to Italy, and the bathing suit failed in an embarrassing way. It didn't hold up. And I can't say for certain. First of all, the woman who wrote it was hilarious. She's like, let me tell you what happens on an Italian beach when your bathing suit doesn't hold up. And
you get real popular.
And I like to think, I feel like I know McCardell well enough to know that she kept that letter because that would have really bothered her. It would have really upset her that someone saved up for one of her bathing suits and it didn't work. And I can imagine that she troubleshot what happened. Was it the material? Was it the design? Who manufactured it? But the other letters she kept, and there were many of these, were from women who wore her clothes. And these were beautiful handwritten letters. And this one was 10 pages long, and it was a woman's memoir. I mean, it was her life story almost. And she said, well, I spilled some clothing dye on this dress, ending the career of a really wonderful garment. I bought it 10 years ago when I was pregnant, and I wore it when I was pregnant, and then I took it in and I wore it when I wasn't pregnant, and then I let it out again when I was pregnant again, and I wore it in the Amazon when my husband was stationed over there, and I went down the Nile in this boat, and she's talking about this life that she lived, this amazing, robust life. And at the end of it, she said, thank you for the very good dress. And then she said, I wouldn't trade this one dress for a house full of Dior's. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So we're going to open it. So we'd love to open it up to questions from you guys. So who has a good question? Yeah.
I'm really interested by what you said about the influence of current events, and particularly World War II, on how her design changed. And I know that another major development on the fashion industry that came out of World War II was the development of synthetic materials like nylon that were so rooted in military research. So how did that, affect her career and her path forward as a designer when that development hit fashion, knowing that is like the nuclear bomb of fast fashion?
It was, yeah. I mean, at the time, so she asked about like the textile development at the time was really fast and furious. And nylon actually came out before the war. So nylon was introduced at the World's Fair in Queens, and then the nylons went away with the war, and everyone's like, what happened to the nylons? And this is that moment where you see women doing leg makeup where it made it look like they had nylons on, but it was really just their eyeliner. But yeah, the textile development, and what's interesting is a lot of the textiles that were being engineered at the time were like these old home ec women, not old, but these women who studied home economics because they were doing textile research and manufacturing at places like Iowa. So we had it wasn't just the textile mills making cotton, it was this moment of fast advancement in human-made materials that allowed rayon to look like silk, or wicking away fabric like a wool jersey didn't wrinkle. So one of the things McCardell did was she loved to experiment with fabric, but she also loved to think about how fabric affected an experience. Again, with wool jersey, you could pack it into a suitcase and it wouldn't wrinkle, and then you didn't have to worry about laundering it. She was very, very irritated that like French people would say, oh, it's silk, we need to wear a silk wrap. And she'd be like, well, why don't we wear tweed? It's cold at night. So one of the things that interested me about McCardell is she did not gender fabric. So think about that. We gender fabric. We gender colors. Her bosses were like, women aren't allowed to wear tweed evening coats. That's ridiculous. And so I think that one of the interesting things about her was she was very open to experimenting with new fabrics. And a lot of textile manufacturers came to her and said, if we did this, what would happen? If we did that, what could happen? And at one point in the book, I write about how she made a dress out of redwood fibers because they were trying to make sustainable fabrics out of redwood fibers because they were thinking about a world at war where supply chains were interrupted. And could we find more sustainable materials? So yeah, it was there's a whole other book in the fabric, which I didn't bore you with too much.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yes.
You haven't mentioned color and how she used color in her clothes.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a bummer again about having a black and white photo insert. So please do go look online at the color that she used. Yeah, she had such a great eye with colorways, and she had such a great way of taking like mitering, she would take these stripes and she would put them down the center in a way that like the fabric and the color became the design. And again, that was very thoughtful. And she, her use of color is just incredible. And I really wish I could have put some full color
What were some
photos.
of her like go-to colors?
She loved like a rich red. She loved some rusts. She loved green. There's a vibrant green bathing suit that she did that the photographer Louise Dahl Wolf photographed. And so she was really thoughtful about creating colorways that felt surprising, but also weren't so shocking that you couldn't keep. She also was like, oh, if you need a new color, dye it. Like, she had no problem in telling people to make her clothes their own, which I love too.
Yeah, Lauren?
Hi, I'm a writer as well, and I was interested in how you balanced the research and the writing of this book and the time that you spend on each, because I know that when I'm researching a really fascinating subject, it's like you could research it, forever, and that's at some point you just have to stop and write your own prose. So I'm interested in did you research kind of chapter by chapter, or did you do tons of research, write all this note, and then just sit down to write? How did you break that up?
I need the tyranny of a deadline. So that's why I pitched a story to David at the Washington Post magazine initially, because I liked to use my journalism as a way to test drive stories. I really liked to, and I had, again, the great fortune of an editor who believed in long form journalism that was narrative in its structure. But David knows well where he would have to call me up and be like, Elizabeth, you realize we are going to print. And I'm like, oh, right. But to answer your question, I think there's that sort of initial research that you need to have enough to pitch the book. I sold the book on proposal to write the story. And then I got to a point where I started writing. And then in the writing, I realized, oh gosh, there's a hole here and I need more. So I feel like the research never ended. I felt like I was researching up until the end, especially when I hired a fact checker to fact check the book. FYI, publishers don't pay fact checkers, so writers have to buy them themselves. So a lot of your nonfiction books have never been fact checked. Sidebar. But then the fact checker came to me and said, oh, this is interesting, but what about this? And then I would have to go back and research. So I could lose myself in research. I really over-research. I really over-research. But with this book, my goal had been to try and write it more as a narrative story where you're kind of walking alongside McCardell. And so to be able to write a scene factually, I had to triangulate what I was reading in her letters, what I knew was happening in time, what was happening in New York. I looked up weather reports. I looked up the shipping news. I looked up the shipping reports. I understood if she had a rough passage on that boat trip, if it was a calm passage. She mentioned a lot of people in her letters, and then I would go down rabbit holes with those letters. And as every editor I've ever worked with has said to me at some point, Elizabeth, that is a really fascinating sidebar, but we have to cut that because you're not allowed to.
And if I could just say, you did such amazing research, but the book wears the research lightly. There's never a spot in that whole book where I felt like it got bogged down with whoa, okay, wrap it up. I don't need, it's like but at the same time, there's all these interesting sort of little windows into a process in fashion and sewing or some kind of historical moment, so that it feels rich and everything's contextualized. So there's that, the depth of the research, but then there's also how you crafted it.
Well, and Annie Dillard, one of my favorite writers, said once, she had this story about a photography student who kept going back with this stack of photos, and the mentor would pull out the ones he liked and put the other ones he didn't like aside. And the mentor said one year, you keep coming back with this one landscape and I keep putting it in the no pile. Why do you keep bringing it back? And he said, because I had to climb a mountain to get it. And I think that you can feel it when a writer is showing you the mountain they climbed. And I tried really hard not to do that in the writing.
What I wanted to say was, I read the book and I love it. It's probably one of the best books I've read in a long time. But what I felt when I was reading it, when you have those normal conversations with people that you really jive with, that you really click with, you have these flows of conversation, and then somebody does a deep dive into a lot of really interesting factual information, but it ties into what you've already been talking about. And that's what I think she does so beautifully with this book, is you just feel the real flow, and you just feel like it's a real natural process that you're a part of.
Yeah,
So
I love
Thank
that.
you so much.
Yes.
Oh my gosh,
That's
thank
why we
you.
should hang out with smart friends, right?
I just wanted to ask, what happened to the brand after she died? Dior died, and is still around?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, McCardell really invented not only the clothing that we wear, a lot of it, or originated or pioneered. She also was kind of pioneering the idea of the ready-to-wear American multifaceted designer. And so she was kind of building the bridge as she was walking across it. There was no precedent in New York when she died in 1958 for carrying on the brand of a ready-to-wear dead designer. It didn't exist. Haute couture in Paris had centuries of of systems in place, and Dior had already knighted a young man named Yves Saint Laurent to take over when he was ready to leave. Interesting enough, Dior and McCardell also died 3 months apart, like 6 months apart maybe. So they it's so fascinating to me because I never realized that connection. So Dior's brand carried on. McCardell's partner at the time tried to carry on, and in fact, a woman you'll meet in the book, Mildred Orrick, tried to help. She was a friend. They had a complicated friendship, but then they just didn't know how to keep up without her. And what's interesting is McCardell did mentor a lot of designers because she wanted to kind of pull it out of hand, and so there are plenty of people who could have stepped into the role, and it's a shame that they didn't. But yeah, the label, the copyright trademark reverted back to the family, and they just let it die.
Would you say that's why she's so forgotten, or is there something else at play? Because I was just wondering, I haven't read the book yet, so maybe you answer this, but why did everyone forget her? How did we get to where we are now?
You are asking a question I also wanted to understand, how is it that we've divorced her name from the clothes that she made? And as I write in my introduction, my goal wasn't just to sew her name back onto her designs, but to also talk about why she did it and how this was part of a larger movement. I think it's a couple of reasons. She died young. She died at a time when a label wasn't carried on. I think it's because she was a woman, because how popular right now are hidden histories of forgotten women, because we do not write women into history. And so it wasn't just Claire who was forgotten. It was the entire mid-century 30s and 40s band of women who invented an entire industry, truly. So they all deserve to be remembered. And so, and I think too, we have a tendency to prioritize high fashion, the silhouette that seems dramatic and worn on the red carpet. McCardell has become so prevalent as to be invisible. So in some ways, and this is a little dramatic perhaps, but think about the light bulb. We just use it every day. We all wear ballet flats, capri pants, wrap dresses, mix and match separates, hoodies. I could go on and on and on. And her designs, she succeeded. She wanted us to be able to be comfortable and wear clothes well in the world to live our lives. But her name got divorced from that. That's a great question. So I grapple with that at the end of the book. I have other reasons too, but sadly, I think a lot of women are forgotten.
Not you, lady. Not today. Okay, did I see one other hand over here? You go, and you'll be our last question.
You kind of already answered it, but I was just going to ask, what do you think, if Claire came back and saw fashion trends today? Because on one hand, absolutely, she succeeded because women are wearing pants and suits and mix and match. But on the other hand, I have noticed that we're starting to kind of go back to the old trends, we're taking away functional pockets, and a lot of women are starting to wear waist trainers and corsets, and then fast fashion is becoming popular, so the quality isn't as good. So what do you think, through her lens, what do you think she would think if she saw the fashion trends?
That's a great question.
I think she'd be appalled for a number of reasons. Number one, she didn't get the last word. Jacques Foth did, who runs most of the design companies right now. It's men. Right now, all of the major design brands have men at the helm. There was just a big shakeup in fashion. So every single one, Dior, Chanel, everybody, it is still very difficult for a woman to ascend to a leadership position or be a partner in her own firm. Fast fashion would irritate her more than anything because she did not believe in waste. She was an environmentalist in a lot of ways. She was someone who, you'll read in the book, got her inspiration in nature. She believed in, her goal was that you would buy a dress of hers and have it your entire life. In 1953, she got a retrospective of her work, one of the first American designers to be in a fine arts gallery. She wore a 10-year-old dress to that opening, and I love that because that tells you what she believes. There was something else in that, another thing that would make her mad. Oh, corsets. Part of why I wanted to write this book is I felt like we are back in that Betty Friedan moment. Look, I have less rights today in America than I did when I was born in 1973. And that's ridiculous. And I'm mad. And it's no joke that the new designer of Dior premiered Sabrina Carpenter at a show in Paris in June in a revival of the new look. She is wearing the bar suit. It is no joke that every image we have from the billionaire's wedding that happened in Venice is a woman in dresses that look like she has no waist, or that she's wearing a corseted gown that looks exactly like a corset from the 1860s. So what I hope you walk away with from this book is the tides of fashion shift, and sadly so do the rights of women. And we are back in a moment where we're being fed a narrative that is being shown in our clothing.
And there are women who will continue to fight
And
that.
we will continue to fight that.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you for this
Thank
book.
you. Thank you.